On September 21st, 1938, an unrelenting force of nature tore through New England, leaving an indelible mark on the region's history. The Great New England Hurricane, later nicknamed the Long Island Express due to its swift and unexpected arrival, became one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike the northeastern United States. In a matter of hours, it claimed the lives of over 600 people, caused injuries to thousands more, and left countless communities utterly unrecognizable. The storm's ferocity was unmatched. It first formed as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa, traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, where warm waters fueled its growth into a formidable hurricane. By the time it reached the southeastern United States, meteorologists had grossly underestimated its trajectory. Believing it would veer out to sea, little warning was given to residents along the northeastern coast. In truth, the hurricane was barreling straight for New England at an alarming speed of nearly 70 miles per hour, faster than any hurricane previously recorded. New England was particularly vulnerable to such an event. At the time, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best. The region lacked the satellite technology and sophisticated warning systems we take for granted today. This left residents unaware of the magnitude of the storm, many continuing their daily routines as disaster approached. Adding to this, the infrastructure was ill-prepared for such an assault. Homes, businesses, and roads were constructed without consideration for hurricane-strength winds or catastrophic flooding. The context in which the storm arrived made its impact even more harrowing. The late 1930s were marked by economic strife. As the Great Depression lingered on, many communities were still reeling from the historic floods of 1936, which had decimated homes and livelihoods across the region. For families struggling to rebuild, the 1938 hurricane was not just a natural disaster, it was an unimaginable blow to their chances of recovery. The storm brought a unique and destructive element rarely seen in the region, a storm surge of unparalleled force. As it made landfall on Long Island and moved northward, it pushed an enormous wall of water into coastal communities. Towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, and New London, Connecticut, were among the first to experience the storm's wrath. The surge obliterated homes, docks, and entire neighborhoods, leaving survivors clinging to rooftops or swept away entirely. This was just the beginning. The storm's devastation would stretch far beyond these first few hours, spreading across New England with unimaginable speed and ferocity. As the Great New England Hurricane made its approach, the region's unpreparedness set the stage for disaster. By mid-morning on September 21st, 1938, dark clouds began to gather along the southern New England coastline, and the winds picked up with unnerving speed. Yet few recognized the signs of the impending catastrophe. This was a time before widespread hurricane education. Many residents assumed such storms couldn't reach the northeastern United States with significant force. What followed was a tragedy of staggering proportions. When the storm made landfall on Long Island shortly after noon, it unleashed winds of over 120 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 150 miles per hour. Buildings were torn apart as if made of paper, and trees, some centuries old, were uprooted in seconds. Entire forests were leveled, and the sound of snapping trunks and howling winds created an eerie soundtrack to the devastation. By the time the storm crossed the Long Island Sound and struck southern New England, it had evolved into a once-in-a-lifetime meteorological event. The hurricane's speed compounded its destructive power, giving residents little time to react. In the coastal towns of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, the storm surged as high as 17 feet in some areas, inundating homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. Rivers such as the Connecticut and Merrimack overflowed, spreading the floodwaters far inland. In Providence, Rhode Island, the devastation was particularly severe. Downtown streets became rivers, with floodwaters rising to over 13 feet in some areas. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, and the power grid collapsed, leaving the city in total darkness. Across the state, coastal communities like Narragansett and Westerly bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Stories emerged of residents climbing onto rooftops or clinging to debris to survive. For many, help was simply too far away to arrive in time. Compounding the chaos was the hurricane's unpredictable path. Meteorologists had expected the storm to move out to sea, leading many in northern New England to believe they were safe. Instead, the hurricane made an abrupt turn northward, catching even experienced weather forecasters off guard. This miscalculation allowed false confidence to spread among the population, further delaying evacuation and preparation efforts. As the storm pushed further inland, its reach extended into Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Maine, where hurricane-strength winds and heavy rainfall caused rivers to overflow. In Massachusetts, Boston experienced severe flooding and wind damage, though the city was spared the worst of the storm surge. Rural areas, however, were hit hard with barns, silos, and farmhouses destroyed, leaving many families homeless overnight. While the wind and rain were terrifying enough, one of the hurricane's most chilling features was its speed. Moving at an average of 47 miles per hour, it allowed little time for emergency responders or civilians to organize rescue efforts. The storm's ferocity and swiftness left a lasting impression on those who lived through it, a haunting reminder of how unpredictable and deadly nature can be. As the storm's violent core tore through New England, the human toll mounted rapidly. Entire families were caught in the crossfire of relentless winds and rising waters, their lives upended in an instant. Survivors would recount harrowing tales of perseverance in the face of unimaginable odds, stories that revealed both the immense cruelty of the storm and the resilience of those who endured it. In coastal communities, the storm surge proved particularly lethal. In towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, walls of water swept away entire streets, dragging homes, vehicles, and people into the ocean. Families scrambled to higher ground, often taking refuge in attics, only to find themselves trapped as water levels continued to rise. For many, the race to escape became a desperate battle against time. In one chilling account, a man clung to a floating door for hours, battered by debris, until he was eventually rescued by a passing boat. The hurricane's ferocity extended far inland, catching rural residents off guard. In the Connecticut River Valley, farmers faced devastation as barns were flattened, livestock drowned, and crops were obliterated by the torrential rain. Entire communities were left isolated, with roads washed out and bridges destroyed, leaving rescue teams unable to reach those in need. In Vermont and New Hampshire, flash floods turned serene streams into raging torrents, sweeping away anything in their path. The economic toll on New Englanders was catastrophic. Many small business owners lost their livelihoods overnight, with storefronts reduced to rubble or submerged under feet of water. Fishermen, a cornerstone of the region's economy, saw their boats destroyed and harbors rendered unusable. The already fragile economy, still recovering from the Great Depression, was dealt a crushing blow, leaving many families struggling to rebuild without financial resources or government aid. Heroism emerged amid the chaos. In Providence, police officers and firefighters braved the floodwaters to rescue stranded residents, forming human chains to guide people to safety. The U.S. Coast Guard deployed ships and personnel to recover survivors from wreckage-strewn waters, often risking their lives in the process. In smaller communities, neighbors banded together to provide makeshift shelters, share food, and care for the injured. One of the most poignant aspects of the disaster was its impact on children. In New London, Connecticut, a schoolhouse was swept away by the storm surge, trapping students and teachers inside. While many perished, some were saved through daring rescues, leaving behind stories of courage and heartbreak that would be remembered for generations. Parents searched tirelessly for missing children, clinging to hope, despite the overwhelming destruction around them. Even in the face of such devastation, the people of New England displayed remarkable determination. For every account of loss and suffering, there were also stories of survival and solidarity. Families who had lost everything found solace in the kindness of strangers, as communities rallied together to provide food, clothing, and shelter. The storm, while leaving a trail of destruction, also revealed the strength of human connection in times of crisis. As the storm subsided, the true scale of the disaster became evident. The devastation that the 1938 hurricane left in its wake reshaped New England, affecting not only the physical landscape, but also the region's collective psyche. The once familiar towns and cities were now ghostly remnants, their landscapes marred by the ruins of buildings, downed trees, and miles of debris-laden streets. Emergency response teams, local authorities, and volunteers scrambled to provide aid, but the task was daunting. The challenge was not just clearing roads or salvaging belongings, it was piecing together shattered lives. One of the most pressing concerns in the days after the hurricane was ensuring the safety and well-being of survivors. Makeshift shelters sprang up in schools, community centers, and churches. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat injuries, ranging from broken bones and deep lacerations to illnesses stemming from contaminated water. The disaster left thousands without homes, forcing many to take refuge in temporary housing while rebuilding efforts began in earnest. Communities, which had been torn apart, began to come together with an incredible display of unity, determined to rebuild their homes and lives. The financial costs of the hurricane were staggering. In the immediate aftermath, Estimates put the total damage at around $400 million, a figure equivalent to several billion dollars today. The storm's economic impact was not limited to property damage. It was felt throughout New England's industries. Fishing, shipping, and trade were particularly hard hit, contributing to the already dire economic climate of the Great Depression. The storm underscored the vulnerability of the region's infrastructure and brought attention to the urgent need for improvements to withstand future catastrophes. This catastrophe ultimately spurred significant changes in how the United States approached weather forecasting and disaster preparedness. The Great New England Hurricane was a wake-up call that underscored the limitations of meteorological technology of the time. Before this event, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best, with limited tools and data for tracking storms. The 1938 hurricane led to advancements in this field, laying the groundwork for modern forecasting. While the storm had taken the country by surprise, it served as a catalyst for improvements such as the establishment of the National Weather Service, which would eventually employ more sophisticated radar systems and computer models to predict the path and intensity of hurricanes with greater accuracy. Infrastructure development was also a significant outcome of the hurricane's aftermath. Coastal areas that had once been vulnerable to the forces of nature saw the construction of seawalls, stronger flood barriers, and improved building codes. These measures were intended to protect both human lives and property from future disasters. The storm left New England with a lasting legacy of resilience, a reminder that in the face of nature's immense power, preparation and unity are the keys to survival. The memory of the 1938 hurricane continues to hold a place in New England's collective consciousness. Annual hurricane preparedness drills, community education, and awareness campaigns have all been influenced by the lessons learned from that fateful September day. Families who lived through it passed down stories of survival and loss, ensuring that the impact of the storm was never forgotten. For generations, the event has been seen as both a tragedy and a triumph of human spirit, a chapter in the history of the region that speaks to the importance of respect for the forces of nature, community solidarity, and the never-ending work of rebuilding and fortifying in the wake of disaster. As we reflect on the legacy of the Great New England Hurricane, it becomes clear that while nature can be merciless, the courage and resilience of those who face such challenges can be inspiring. The storm's wrath might have left deep scars, but the response to it paved the way for a safer, more prepared future. And so this storm is not just a story of loss, it is also a testament to the strength of the people who lived through it and the lessons learned that continue to shape how we prepare for the unexpected. To understand why the Griffith Park fire of October 3, 1933 turned so deadly, we have to look at the desperate conditions of the time. America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and Los Angeles was no exception. Jobs had vanished, and men from every background, clerks, teachers, ministers, and laborers were standing in breadlines. Relief programs offered a lifeline, giving counties federal funds to hire the unemployed for public works projects. The pay was meager, just 40 cents an hour, but in an era when families struggled to afford food, it meant survival. Griffith Park, the sprawling wilderness of rugged chaparral in the center of Los Angeles, became one of the city's largest work sites. Thousands of unemployed men were assigned to clear dry brush, cut fire breaks, and carve new roads through the steep hillsides. On the morning of October 3rd, more than 3,700 men were scattered throughout the park, divided into large squads of 50 to 80 workers, each supervised by a straw boss. These were not trained supervisors, and the workers were not firefighters. They were ordinary men trying to support their families during a time of despair. Journalists of the era described the men's cautious optimism, noting that after months of hopelessness, they finally had steady if exhausting work. The irony was that the same brittle brush they were paid to clear would soon feed a fire that turned the park into a death trap. This fragile setup, thousands of untrained laborers working in dangerous terrain under inexperienced leaders, created the conditions for disaster. The morning of October 3rd, 1933, seemed like any other workday inside Griffith Park. The sun was unrelenting, the air was bone dry, and the Santa Ana winds carried the scent of dust and heat. Crews hacked away at brittle brush with shovels, hoes, and pickaxes, their clothing soaked through with sweat. No one realized that the same conditions fueling their exhaustion were also laying the groundwork for catastrophe. Shortly after noon, smoke began curling upward from a ravine near the mineral wells area of the park. Some accounts suggested that sparks from a worker's cooking fire might have escaped, while others pointed to smoldering embers left from a trash burn earlier that morning. Whatever the cause, the timing was disastrous. The winds turned what could have been a minor blaze into a wall of flame racing across the hillsides. The fire leapt from one slope to another, climbing ridges in seconds and choking the canyons with smoke. Untrained men with little more than shovels and blankets tried to stamp it out, but that they were no match for a wildfire feeding on acres of dry chaparral. Supervisors shouted contradictory orders, and panic spread as the fire split into several fast-moving fronts. Instead of evacuating, many of the crews were ordered to fight the flames head-on, placing them directly in harm's way. This moment, the spark combined with confusion and poor decisions, was the turning point. What could have been a small, contained fire now became a fast-moving disaster. Thousands of men found themselves trapped on rugged slopes with no escape routes, facing an inferno they had no training to fight. The stage was now set for one of the deadliest workplace disasters Los Angeles had ever seen. By early afternoon, the fire had grown into a monster no one could control. What began as a single column of smoke now spread into multiple fronts, each one pushed by strong Santa Ana winds that howled through the canyons. The men working the slopes had no fire-resistant clothing, no protective gear, and no water hoses. Their only tools were shovels, picks, and blankets, laughably inadequate against walls of fire stretching dozens of feet high. As the flames roared downhill, workers became disoriented in the smoke and confusion. Some ran toward what they thought was safety, only to find themselves surrounded as the fire circled back with terrifying speed. Others tried to climb the ridges, but the steep terrain and thick brush slowed them down. The heat was so intense that it dried out lungs with every breath, leaving men gasping and collapsing on the slopes. Supervisors shouted for workers to hold their ground and dig fire breaks, but those breaks crumbled in minutes as sparks leapt over them. In the chaos, men were caught in ravines that acted like chimneys, funneling flames straight over their heads. Some scrambled into dry creek beds, only to be smothered by falling embers and thick smoke. The lack of any organized escape plan meant survival depended on chance, on which way the wind turned, or which canyon they chose to flee. By the time the fire had raged for just a few short hours, Griffith Park was unrecognizable. Hillsides that had been alive with brush and trees were reduced to blackened skeletons. Scattered across the terrain were the tools of labor: shovels, pickaxes, and half-burned work gloves, evidence of a workforce overwhelmed by a force of nature they never had a chance to fight. The inferno had trapped them, and the worst was still yet to come. When the flames finally died down, the scale of the tragedy began to reveal itself. Dozens of men had been killed, many of them trapped in gullies or overcome by the choking smoke. Their bodies were discovered scattered across the hillsides, a grim reminder of just how unprepared they had been. In a single afternoon, one of the largest urban parks in the nation had become a graveyard. Los Angeles awoke the next day to headlines that stunned the city. The death toll climbed with each new report, making it the deadliest wildfire in California history at the time. Families rushed to hospitals and makeshift morgues, searching for loved ones who had not returned home from work. Most of the victims had been day laborers, men with little choice but to take dangerous jobs in the depths of the Great Depression. The devastation extended beyond the human cost. Hillsides once covered in lush chaparral were stripped bare, leaving the park vulnerable to erosion and flooding in the months to come. The blackened landscape stood in stark contrast to the clear skies above, a reminder that nature's fury could wipe out decades of growth in just hours. The damage was not only physical but psychological, shaking the city's faith in its ability to protect its workers and its land. What made this disaster even more haunting was how preventable it might have been. There had been no safety training, no fire crews stationed nearby, and no system to evacuate workers quickly. The tragedy exposed a dangerous gap between the city's ambitions and its preparedness. As news spread across the country, it was no longer just a local story. It became a symbol of what could happen when human labor collided with unchecked natural disaster. In the weeks after the fire, the city of Los Angeles launched a series of investigations to understand how such devastation could happen in just a single afternoon. Officials quickly discovered that there had been almost no planning for a disaster of this scale. Workers had been sent into the flames with shovels and branches, tools that stood no chance against a fast-moving wildfire. Questions began to surface about why proper firefighting crews had not been on hand when thousands of men were laboring in one of the driest, most fire-prone parks in the region. The inquiry revealed that the victims had not been city employees, but day laborers, hired through relief programs. This meant they had virtually no training, no protective gear, and no rights to demand safer conditions. Their desperation for wages in the depths of the Great Depression left them vulnerable, and in Griffith Park, that vulnerability turned deadly. What made the situation worse was that supervisors reportedly gave conflicting orders, leaving men trapped when the fire shifted direction. Witnesses described chaos on the hillsides, some groups told to dig fire breaks, others ordered to flee, and still others left with no instructions at all. By the time organized firefighting units arrived, the flames had already swept through the canyons where the laborers worked. The investigations painted a picture of confusion, negligence, and a city unprepared for the risks it had created. For the families of the victims, the findings offered little comfort. Though officials promised reforms and safety improvements, no one was ever held directly accountable for the lives lost. The tragedy was labeled an accident, and the men who died were remembered more as statistics than as individuals. The investigations showed the public that this was not just a natural disaster, it was also the product of human failure. And that realization set the stage for the heated debates that would follow in the years to come. The Griffith Park fire of 1933 left scars that reached far beyond the canyons where the flames burned. It exposed how quickly desperation, poor planning, and mismanagement can turn a local blaze into one of the deadliest workplace disasters in California history. For the city of Los Angeles, the fire became a sobering lesson in the cost of ignoring safety when human lives are at stake. Relief programs across the country were forced to reconsider how they deployed untrained labor, especially in hazardous conditions. In the years that followed, new policies slowly emerged, demanding better oversight and more professional firefighting standards. Training equipment and safety procedures were strengthened, though these changes came far too late for the men who had perished on that October day. Even so, Griffith Park's tragedy became a turning point, reminding communities that wildfires were not just natural events, but disasters shaped by human decisions. From a modern perspective, the fire serves as a warning of what can happen when economic hardship collides with dangerous work. It shows how vulnerable societies can be when people are forced into peril for survival, and how easily leaders can underestimate risks in pursuit of short-term goals. As cities continue to expand into fire-prone landscapes, the same choices and mistakes made in 1933 still loom as possibilities. The legacy of Griffith Park is not only about flames and smoke, it is about accountability. The workers who died were casualties of more than fire. They were victims of neglect, desperation, and a city unprepared for disaster. Their story stands as both a memorial and a cautionary tale. If history repeats itself, the consequences could be just as deadly, and that is what makes the Griffith Park fire of 1933 a haunting reminder of the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The Dust Bowl disaster of the 1930s is one of the most significant environmental catastrophes in American history. Imagine waking up one day to find the sky pitch black as if night had fallen in the middle of the day. It wasn't a natural occurrence like an eclipse. It was the result of massive dust storms that could reach terrifying heights, sometimes more than a mile into the sky. These storms carried thousands of tons of dirt and debris across the landscape, suffocating everything in their path. The Dust Bowl, which ravaged the Great Plains, was not a singular event, but a series of devastating dust storms that occurred over several years, starting in the early 1930s. It was a time of extreme hardship for farmers and communities already struggling with the impact of the Great Depression. In fact, many families living in the heart of the Great Plains were hit with one disaster after another. First, an economic collapse that left them in poverty, followed by a severe drought that turned fertile farmland into a dry, cracked desert. The drought was the first blow. With little rainfall, the soil began to dry up, making it harder for crops to grow. The region, which had once been rich with farmland, began to show signs of stress. But it wasn't just the lack of rain that made things worse, it was the way the land had been treated. As the demand for crops increased, especially wheat during World War I, farmers turned to new farming techniques and technology, such as tractors and mechanized plows. While these advancements allowed farmers to cultivate more land, they also disturbed the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The deep-rooted grasses that once held the soil in place were uprooted, leaving the earth exposed and vulnerable to the harsh winds of the plains. By the time the first major dust storm hit in 1931, the land was a ticking time bomb. Winds would blow across the flat landscape, sweeping up the loose topsoil and carrying it for hundreds of miles. The dust clouds, sometimes miles wide, would choke entire towns. The dust didn't just stay in the air, it settled everywhere, blanketing homes, farms, and crops. For people living through the Dust Bowl, it wasn't just the economic struggle or the lack of food that haunted them, it was the constant threat of suffocating dust storms. As the dust storms intensified, they became known as black blizzards, because of how dark and thick the sky would become during these storms. The dust was so heavy that it would block out the sun, and residents would often have to light lamps during the day. The storms were so fierce that they could strip the paint off houses and bury entire buildings in dust. The dust itself wasn't just a nuisance, it was dangerous. Breathing in the fine particles of dirt could lead to respiratory issues, and in many cases it caused dust pneumonia, a deadly condition that claimed the lives of many. In some cases, the storms would last for hours or even days, leaving families trapped inside their homes with little protection from the suffocating dust. For those who tried to escape, the environment outside was no better. The air was thick and choking, with visibility reduced to nearly nothing. The dust storms made daily life nearly impossible. Children couldn't play outside, crops failed, and even basic tasks like cooking and cleaning became monumental challenges. This was the beginning of the Dust Bowl crisis, a period of despair and destruction that would go on to affect millions of people. As farmers struggled with crops that wouldn't grow, many were forced to abandon their lands and homes, fleeing westward in search of better opportunities. But their journey was not an easy one. In part 2 of this story, we'll explore the human toll of the Dust Bowl disaster, as families struggled not only with the environmental devastation, but with the social and economic challenges that came with it. As the dust storms grew more intense, the devastating impact of the Dust Bowl was not limited to the land. It began to tear apart the lives of the people who lived there. Farmers and their families had already been struggling with the effects of the Great Depression, and now they found themselves facing an environmental disaster that seemed impossible to overcome. The crops that once fed their families and provided income were now nothing but lifeless husks, the soil beneath them reduced to dry, barren dust. The human toll was immense. With crops failing and the soil eroding away, many farmers found themselves unable to provide for their families. Desperate for a solution, some turned to the government for assistance, but help was slow to come. By the time the storms hit full force, it was clear that life as they knew it was no longer possible for the people of the Great Plains. Families who had farmed the land for generations were forced to abandon their homes and livelihoods. The journey to find new opportunities was long and grueling. The roads leading out of the Dust Bowl were lined with families in old cars, often filled with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and a few meager belongings. These refugees became known as Okies, even though they came from all over the affected states, including Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. They were searching for a better life, but they were often met with hostility and resentment. In the early stages of the migration, many of the refugees hoped to find work in the agricultural fields of California, which was seen as a promised land for those seeking refuge from the Dust Bowl. However, they quickly realized that the golden opportunity they had dreamed of was out of reach. In California, they found competition for jobs was fierce, and the work that was available was often low-paying and difficult. Migrant workers were not welcomed with open arms. Locals viewed the influx of refugees as a burden, taking jobs and using up already limited resources. The conditions that the refugees faced in California were nothing short of dismal. Many of them had no choice but to live in makeshift camps, sometimes in the most squalid conditions. These camps were overcrowded, with little access to basic necessities like water, sanitation, or healthcare. Disease spread quickly in these conditions, and the dust storms that continued to haunt them in the Great Plains followed them to the west, further degrading their already precarious situation. In addition to the physical hardships, the social toll was equally devastating. The migration of so many people caused significant social strain, with communities in California and other states struggling to support the large number of displaced families. Tensions rose, and the refugees found themselves alienated, often treated as outsiders, or even blamed for the economic struggles of the local population. The Dust Bowl not only displaced people, but also destroyed the way of life that had been established for generations. Entire towns in the Great Plains were abandoned, as the residents left in search of a better future. Schools closed, businesses shut down, and once bustling communities became ghost towns. The land that had once been rich with crops was now a vast wasteland, leaving behind nothing but memories of a time when the Great Plains had been a hub of agricultural prosperity. While many of the refugees managed to make new lives in other parts of the country, others never returned to the land they had lost. The Dust Bowl had not only caused environmental devastation, but also led to the breakdown of entire communities. Families had to come to terms with the fact that the land they had cultivated for generations was no longer capable of sustaining them. By the mid-1930s, the federal government began to recognize the full extent of the disaster and took some steps to address the human toll. The government created programs to provide temporary relief for migrant families and encouraged them to relocate to other regions with better farming opportunities. These efforts, however, could not undo the psychological scars that had been left by the experience. In Part 3, we will look deeper into the environmental damage caused by the Dust Bowl and explore how the devastation of the land led to the further degradation of the lives of those affected. The story of the Dust Bowl is not only about the land, but also about the resilience of the people who had to adapt, survive, and rebuild in the face of one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. As the Dust Bowl progressed throughout the early part of the 1930s, the environmental destruction began to spiral out of control. The Great Plains, which had once been fertile and lush with crops, had become a barren landscape. What had once been a sprawling agricultural region, home to wheat, corn, and other crops, was now being slowly devoured by wind and dust. The impact of this widespread soil erosion and desertification was nothing short of catastrophic, not only for the land itself, but for the livelihoods of the families who depended on it. One of the primary causes of this environmental catastrophe was the failure to recognize the delicate balance required to maintain the soil. For years, farmers had been plowing the land with little regard for sustainable practices. The introduction of mechanized farming equipment, such as tractors, made it easier to cultivate the land, but also led to the destruction of native grasses that once held the soil together. With the grasses gone and no proper crop rotation or other soil conservation techniques in place, the earth became loose and vulnerable to the wind. As the drought of 1931 to 1933 gripped the Great Plains, these factors combined with record-high temperatures to create the perfect storm for dust storms, or black blizzards, to form. When these storms occurred, they would whip through the air at speeds of over 60 miles per hour, often rising up to 1 mile high, carrying dust and debris for hundreds of miles. The dust was so thick that it would turn day into night, and people would be unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. These storms were not just inconvenient, they were dangerous. With every storm, the topsoil, which was once rich and fertile, was blown away. The crops that remained in the fields were suffocated, unable to grow in the thick layers of dust that covered everything. The winds did not just tear through the fields, they tore at the very essence of the land, eroding the topsoil and leaving nothing but a dry, cracked surface beneath. Once proud farmland became wasteland, incapable of sustaining life. The environmental toll was not just on crops and soil, it also severely affected the wildlife of the Great Plains. Animals such as birds and small mammals either fled to other areas or died from the lack of food and shelter. The region's once thriving ecosystems, which relied on the moisture and balance of the land, began to disintegrate. The air quality also suffered as dust storms released particles that made breathing difficult and even dangerous. Respiratory illnesses such as dust pneumonia became widespread, particularly among children and the elderly, who were most vulnerable to the polluted air. For farmers, the collapse of their land felt like the loss of everything they had worked for, everything they had built their lives around. The cycle of dust storms and crop failure dragged on year after year, creating a sense of hopelessness. In many cases, it was not just the financial losses that devastated families. It was the emotional and psychological toll of watching the land that had been home for generations turn against them. Entire towns were abandoned. As the once thriving agricultural hubs of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado became ghost towns. The land that once yielded crops now seemed to curse those who attempted to farm it. The government's slow response to the disaster made the situation even worse. During the early years of the Dust Bowl, there was no coordinated effort to address the soil erosion or offer any aid to the devastated farmers. It wasn't until the middle of the 1930s that the government took significant steps to try to mitigate the damage. But by then, the worst effects had already been felt. The environmental destruction caused by the Dust Bowl not only changed the landscape permanently, but also set the stage for a broader reevaluation of farming practices across the United States. The lasting impact of the Dust Bowl's environmental devastation was felt long after the dust storms subsided. The region was left scarred, with many parts of the Great Plains experiencing continued soil degradation. It took years of concerted effort to restore the land to some degree of fertility, and even then, the lessons learned from the Dust Bowl would have a lasting influence on agricultural policy and conservation practices. In Part 4, we will explore how the government's response to the Dust Bowl finally began to take shape, and how these efforts helped to rebuild the region and shape future agricultural practices. The lessons learned during this time were crucial in preventing similar environmental disasters from occurring in the future. However, it was the resilience and determination of the people who lived through the Dust Bowl that made the most lasting impact. By the mid-1930s, the effects of the Dust Bowl were becoming painfully clear. Entire regions of the Great Plains were left devastated, and farmers were struggling to survive. However, as the worst of the storms began to subside, efforts to rebuild and recover began to take shape. One of the most crucial turning points came in 1935, when the federal government took decisive action to address the environmental crisis. Recognizing that the Dust Bowl was more than just an agricultural issue, but a national disaster affecting thousands of people, the government began implementing significant changes. The creation of the Soil Conservation Service in 1935 was a key response. The service was established to teach farmers better land management techniques and help restore the land. They introduced measures such as crop rotation, where different crops were grown in sequence to prevent the soil from losing its nutrients, and contour plowing, a method of plowing along the curves of the land to reduce water, runoff, and prevent erosion. In addition to these agricultural policies, the government also focused on providing direct relief for the displaced families who had become known as Dust Bowl refugees. The Resettlement Administration, created in 1935, aimed to relocate struggling families to new lands where the soil was fertile and less prone to erosion. These resettlement programs offered loans to farmers and provided support for relocation, giving many families a chance to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. But the recovery wasn't just about planting new crops or moving people to new lands. It also involved large-scale efforts to reforest the region, with trees planted in rows to act as windbreaks. The Shelter Belt Project, which started in 1934, aimed to create a green barrier of trees to reduce the impact of wind erosion on the soil. More than 220 million trees were planted across a 2,000-mile stretch, stretching from the northern part of the Great Plains down to Texas. The planting of these trees helped stabilize the soil and protect the remaining topsoil from being swept away by the winds. As these programs began to take effect, the environment slowly started to recover. Farmers, equipped with new knowledge and tools, were able to restore the land to some degree. By the late 1930s, many of the dust storms had diminished and crops began to grow again. The efforts of the government and the resilience of the American people allowed for a gradual but steady recovery, although the effects of the Dust Bowl would continue to be felt for years to come. The Dust Bowl's impact didn't just end with the soil restoration efforts. The disaster led to significant changes in the way agriculture was practiced in the United States. Farmers were now more aware of the importance of conservation and sustainable farming methods. The Sarnafer Farm Security Administration also supported programs to encourage more responsible farming with a focus on long-term soil health and water conservation. The Dust Bowl left lasting scars on the people who lived through it. The emotional and psychological toll of losing homes, farms, and loved ones was immense. For many, the journey to rebuild their lives was a long and difficult one. However, it also fostered a sense of unity and perseverance. The Dust Bowl demonstrated just how fragile the balance between humanity and nature can be, and how important it is to take care of the land that sustains us. In the end, the Dust Bowl wasn't just a lesson in the dangers of environmental mismanagement. It was a lesson in the importance of proactive government intervention, community resilience, and environmental stewardship. The policies put in place to combat soil erosion and restore the Great Plains helped shape the future of American agriculture. And while the disaster of the Dust Bowl is now part of history, it remains a stark reminder of the power of nature and the importance of respecting the land. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of the Dust Bowl interesting, be sure to check out our other videos on environmental history and natural disasters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think we can learn from the Dust Bowl to prevent similar environmental disasters in the future? In the summer of 1931, China faced one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, the 1931 China floods, also known as the Yangtze-Huai River floods. Spanning from June to August, these floods devastated central and eastern China, leaving a trail of destruction and loss across major cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and beyond. This catastrophe was not just an isolated event, but the culmination of a series of extreme weather conditions that had plagued the region for several years. The backstory of these floods begins in the late 1920s, when China was already grappling with severe droughts from 1928 to 1930. These droughts had a significant impact on the country, drying up rivers and reducing water levels to dangerous lows. But the winter of 1930 brought a harsh twist, as heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures covered the mountainous areas with thick layers of snow and ice. As the winter gave way to spring in 1931, this snow and ice began to melt, and the resulting water flowed downstream into the Yangtze River. Ordinarily, the Yangtze River and its surrounding areas experience seasonal flooding during the spring, summer, and fall. However, the continuous melting combined with heavy rainfall in early 1931 created a situation that was far from ordinary. By June, those living in low-lying areas along the river had already been forced to abandon their homes as water levels rose at an alarming rate. The summer of 1931 was marked by intense cyclonic activity, with 9 cyclones hitting the region in July alone, far above the average of 2 per year. These cyclones brought unprecedented amounts of rain, further swelling the rivers and causing water levels to reach new heights. By the time the floodwaters peaked in August, much of central and eastern China was underwater. The floodwaters inundated an area of about 180,000 square kilometers, roughly equivalent in size to the combined states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Cities like Wuhan were submerged, and the scale of the disaster was so immense that it quickly overwhelmed local authorities and communities. This introduction sets the stage for understanding how the 1931 floods developed into one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The combination of natural factors, ranging from severe droughts and harsh winters to unrelenting cyclones, created a perfect storm that would lead to untold devastation in the months to come. As we move forward, we'll explore how these events unfolded, the sheer scale of destruction that followed, and the lasting impact of this disaster on China and its people. As 1931 began, a series of environmental conditions converged to create the perfect storm for what would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. In the years leading up to the flood, China had experienced a long drought from 1928 to 1930, which left the ground parched and unable to absorb water effectively. The winter of 1930-1931 was particularly harsh, with severe cold spells that deposited large amounts of snow and ice across the mountainous regions. This snow and ice were set to become a major factor in the unfolding disaster. As the harsh winter gave way to spring, the snow and ice began to melt rapidly, sending torrents of water downstream into the Yangtze River and its tributaries. Ordinarily, this region would experience 3 distinct periods of high water: spring, summer, and fall. But in 1931, the water flow was relentless, combining all 3 high water periods into one continuous, overwhelming deluge. As early as June, the situation was already dire, with heavy rains compounding the melting snow and ice. The Yangtze River swelled to levels not seen since records began, causing those living in low-lying areas to abandon their homes in fear of what was to come. Adding to the chaos, the summer of 1931 saw an unprecedented level of cyclonic activity. 9 cyclones struck the region in July alone, a sharp increase from the usual 2 per year. The torrential rains brought by these storms saturated the ground further, with 4 weather stations along the Yangtze River reporting rainfall exceeding 600 millimeters for the month. The river, already swollen from months of heavy water flow, reached dangerously high levels, pushing against dikes and levees that had held firm for decades. Despite the growing danger, preparations for such a catastrophe were minimal. The flood control infrastructure, already weakened by years of neglect and mismanagement, was simply not equipped to handle the massive volume of water. Communities along the river, already strained from years of drought and economic hardship, were caught off guard by the severity of the situation. Efforts to strengthen dikes and build temporary barriers were quickly overwhelmed as the water levels continued to rise. By late July, it was clear that a disaster of unprecedented scale was imminent. The river's water levels were now at their highest point in living memory, and the first signs of flooding began to appear in low-lying areas. People scrambled to save what they could, but the sheer magnitude of the impending flood left little time for effective evacuation. The stage was set for the 1931 China floods to unleash their full fury on the unsuspecting population. The catastrophic impact of the 1931 China floods began to fully manifest in August. The relentless rains continued, and the Yangtze River, along with other major rivers like the Huai and Yellow Rivers, could no longer contain the immense volume of water. On August 1st, the Yangtze River burst its banks, and the floodwaters surged into the surrounding countryside, overwhelming dikes and inundating vast areas of land. Entire towns and villages were swallowed by the advancing waters. The floods swept through the landscape with unstoppable force, destroying homes, farmlands, and infrastructure. Roads and railways were submerged, cutting off communication and transportation routes, making it nearly impossible for aid to reach the affected areas. The situation was dire, and the people caught in the flood's path had little chance to escape. As the floodwaters spread, the scale of the devastation became clearer. The city of Wuhan, one of China's most important industrial and commercial centers, was among the hardest hit. The city was submerged under several feet of water, leaving only the tops of buildings visible in some areas. The residents of Wuhan, along with millions of others across the floodplain, were forced to seek refuge on rooftops, in trees, and on any high ground they could find. Many clung to makeshift rafts or debris, desperately trying to survive. In the countryside, the situation was even more grim. The floodwaters turned fertile farmlands into vast muddy lakes. Crops that were nearing harvest were destroyed, leading to widespread food shortages. Livestock drowned in the rising waters, further exacerbating the looming famine. The floods also displaced millions of people, leaving them homeless and without access to clean water, food, or medical care. The death toll began to climb rapidly. Drowning claimed the lives of countless individuals in the immediate aftermath of the flood, but the disaster's impact went far beyond the initial surge of water. The stagnant floodwaters became breeding grounds for disease, and epidemics of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in which survivors were forced to live. Malnutrition and exposure to the elements further weakened the already vulnerable population. The government, already stretched thin by economic troubles and political instability, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis. Relief efforts were hampered by the scale of the disaster and the sheer number of people in need. Local authorities and international aid organizations did what they could, but resources were limited and the needs were overwhelming. As the floodwaters slowly receded, they left behind a landscape of devastation. The physical destruction was immense, but the human toll was even greater. The 1931 China floods were not just a natural disaster, but a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The country would be left to grapple with the aftermath for years to come. In the aftermath of the 1931 China floods, the devastation was almost unimaginable. As the floodwaters gradually receded, they revealed a landscape utterly transformed by the disaster. Farmlands that had once been lush and fertile were now barren, coated in a thick layer of silt and debris. The flood had destroyed crops, homes, and infrastructure, leaving millions of people without shelter or means of livelihood. The immediate concern in the weeks following the flood was the humanitarian crisis. With millions of people displaced, there was an urgent need for food, clean water, and medical care. Relief efforts were mounted, but they were hampered by the sheer scale of the disaster. Roads and railways remained damaged or submerged, making it difficult to transport supplies to the worst affected areas. The government, already struggling with internal political instability, found it challenging to coordinate a response on such a massive scale. In the refugee camps that sprung up across the region, conditions were dire. Overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions led to the rapid spread of diseases. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever claimed thousands of lives, adding to the already staggering death toll. The lack of adequate food supplies resulted in widespread malnutrition, and many survivors succumbed to hunger and disease. The social impact of the floods was profound. Families were torn apart, with many losing loved ones to the floodwaters or the subsequent epidemics. The loss of homes and livelihoods meant that entire communities were plunged into poverty, with little hope of recovery in the near term. The psychological trauma of the disaster left deep scars on the survivors. many of whom had witnessed unimaginable horrors during the flood. The economic consequences were equally severe. The destruction of farmlands and the loss of the harvest led to food shortages and skyrocketing prices. The agricultural sector, which was the backbone of China's economy at the time, was decimated. This in turn led to a sharp increase in poverty and unemployment, as farmers and laborers found themselves without work. The disaster also had long-term political repercussions. The government's inadequate response to the crisis fueled public dissatisfaction and unrest. The inability to provide effective relief and the perceived indifference of the authorities to the suffering of the people undermined the government's legitimacy and contributed to the growing sense of discontent across the country. International aid did arrive, but it was not enough to meet the overwhelming needs of the affected population. While various relief organizations and foreign governments provided assistance, the scale of the disaster meant that many people continued to suffer for months and even years after the floodwaters had receded. The 1931 China floods were a turning point in the nation's history. They exposed the vulnerabilities of the country's infrastructure and governance and highlighted the need for better disaster preparedness and response. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would eventually lead to changes in flood control measures and disaster management strategies, but for those who lived through it, the impact of the floods would be felt for a lifetime. The legacy of the 1931 China floods is a somber reminder of the catastrophic power of natural disasters and the profound impact they can have on society. In the years that followed, efforts were made to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. The government began investing in more comprehensive flood control measures, including the construction of dams, levees, and improved drainage systems. These initiatives were aimed at better managing the country's vast river systems and reducing the risk of future floods. One of the key lessons learned from the 1931 floods was the importance of early warning systems and disaster preparedness. The lack of timely information and coordinated response had exacerbated the scale of the disaster. In response, meteorological and hydrological monitoring systems were gradually improved, allowing for more accurate predictions of potential floods and better planning for evacuation and relief efforts. However, the memory of the 1931 floods also served as a stark reminder of the need for sustainable development and environmental stewardship. Deforestation, land reclamation, and other practices that disrupted natural water flows were recognized as contributing factors to the severity of the floods. This realization led to increased awareness of the importance of protecting natural ecosystems as a means of mitigating the impact of future floods. On a social level, the floods had a lasting impact on the people of China. The survivors carried with them the trauma and loss of the disaster, and the event became a defining moment in the collective memory of the nation. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of resilience, as communities came together to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. The 1931 China floods remain one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, with an estimated death toll ranging from 1 million to 4 million people. The exact number may never be known, but the scale of the tragedy is undeniable. The disaster highlighted the need for stronger infrastructure, better disaster preparedness, and a more compassionate response to those in need. In the decades since, China has made significant strides in disaster management and flood control. Modern technology and improved infrastructure have reduced the risk of such a catastrophic event occurring again. Yet, the memory of the 1931 floods continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and the human cost of environmental neglect. As we reflect on the 1931 China floods, we are reminded of the delicate balance between nature and human civilization. It is a balance that requires constant attention and respect, for when it is disrupted, the consequences can be devastating. The floods of 1931 are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity and a sobering reminder of the need to protect our environment and prepare for the challenges that nature may bring.